Good day, Ken Lind here, and welcome to Ken's Hobbies. Today, I'm going to start here on part 3 of my story. Trying to pick up a point here as to where to leave off. Okay, first of all, I should mention a little bit more to where I ended up on part 2, between Imperial Oil and 10th and Victoria Husky. I forgot to mention, there was an era between that where when I moved to Edmonton. I was at Imperial Center, but in the summertime here in Prince George, it gets pretty slack and there's hardly any work that comes in the doors, so I was laid off. My cousin Johnny Nelson in Edmonton heard that I was laid off, and he phoned me and said they're looking for mechanics at a place called Consolidated Concrete in Edmonton, Alberta. And I said, well, Johnny, that's all, as far as I know, it's heavy duty. I'm automotive, my license. Johnny said, well, okay, I'll talk to that I'll tell the owner-operator of the Consolidated Concrete. His name was Doug Tucker. He said, I'll talk to Doug and I'll give you a call back. I said, okay. Well, I got a call back from Johnny, and he says, Doug Tucker said a mechanic is a mechanic. He knows how to pull wrenches. That's all he's concerned in. He says, get him here. So I packed up my stuff, and therefore I moved to Edmonton, Alberta to go work at Consolidated Concrete. And that was the beginning of my heavy-duty career with Consolidated Concrete. It wasn't just on trucks. Most of the trucks were Kenworths, but they had a few whites, and some yet remembered the diamond reels. There was a lot of fun there too while I was at Consolidated. Oh, also, they had a pile of equipment like front-end loaders, forklifts. So it was a very interesting job. Of course, with no income yet to be coming, when I got to Edmonton, I stayed with my blood brother, and his wife. They lived on the west end of Edmonton, and my brother Eric then showed me the loops and all the shortcuts of how to get around Edmonton. Also, what was interesting staying with my brother was his wife's name was Margaret. Margaret used to laugh. She says, I just can't believe that you two are brothers and live so far apart, and so many of our movements are so identical. And I looked at Margaret and said, what do you mean by that? She said, well, both of you mash your potatoes exactly the same way. And a few other things. I guess it's really interesting. Being apart and 500 miles apart, almost 500 miles apart. Yeah, she used to always say, yeah, I can tell you two are brothers. Nothing major really was done there due to the dust from the cement. So if an engine needed an overhaul or something, it was not done there. It was shipped out. Likewise with differentials. So basically if a rear end blew, it was just a re-and-re. One of the highlights I had at Consolidated was, that's where I learned my arc welding from. I can't remember his last name, but his first name was Old Harry. Well, Harry taught me how to do arc welding. I had oxyacetylene welding in my course with the automotive mechanics in BC when I was in college, because there's a lot of times a lot of welding occurred in the automotive field, but nothing to do with arc welding. Another highlight, Consolidated, that's when I first learned to drive trucks, because the first job assignment that was handed to me, I'm looking at the work order, I said to the shop foreman, his name was Al, I said, well, who brings the trucks in? Al looks at me and says, you do. Al, I don't even know how to start the damn things. He says, well, there's a lot there. You got lots of time. Just jump in and go from there. Those of you who have watched Fab Rat's channel have heard Paul say, well, the best way to learn is just jump in and go for it. Yep, well, that's how I learned to have to drive trucks. And in them days, it was an old diamond reel. Another type of truck Consolidated had was a half, I don't know really how to describe it. It was a Freightliner. I call it a half cab over, where you only had, instead of a full length cab like this, you only had a partial cab like that. And when you looked up the right hand window, the engine was kind of like beside you. And that's how I could describe those Freightliners. It's the only way I can describe it. So to give you an idea, let's give you that little description. I had a story about one of the reels after. I'm going to tell you about it. It was slack there, and when the drivers at Consolidated went on strike, well, that was a time where mechanics, we could get caught up with unfinished errands or jobs on the list. And so we had a lot of spare time to spare. So we decided to, well, let's have a little fun. And Harry said, yeah, I'm on for it. So took this old diamond reel, it's known as Rito. We took this old reel in, cut the mixer off, and forget what else we chopped off. We had a competition amongst all of us who could make the best time across the lot. And Consolidated had a big parking lot, so who could make the best time from one end of the lot to the other end of the lot, and how many gears could we get through. We used to have our contests with, and so that was a lot of fun. But that was the beginning of my truck driving career also, not just heavy duty. So basically 3 things happened at Consolidated. Number 1, got my heavy duty. Number 2, arc welding. And number 3, truck driving. Just looking at my notes here to refresh my memory. Eventually getting laid off at Consolidated. At that time I was making so many trips back and forth between Prince George and Edmonton and seeing my girlfriend at that time. We ended up in 1976, decided to live together. So I moved back from Edmonton back to Prince George. Eventually in 1977, got married to Pat. That was my first wife's name. There's the story behind that. Issues came up just after we got married. So back in the same year, about 2 months later, 2 or 3 months, I don't remember exactly which, but an issue came up. So with help of others, we end up moving back to Edmonton. Before I get into places too far ahead, let's see now. Oh, I haven't mentioned about my CB radios. Right. 1970 is when I got into CB radio, introduced and encouraged into getting into with CB radios. I have a little story there, so I'll get that first. As you see back there in earlier videos, I pointed out the old Hallicrafter CB3A. My first experience was, of course, with more electric. Never thought anything of it until later on, 1969. When the place where I used to buy all my electronic parts, got to be friends with the fellow that worked there by the name of Nick Hammersley. He got me encouraged to get back into CB, so thus I picked up back in 1969 to 1970, got back into CB radio. At that time, it was mandatory we had to have licenses to even operate a CB. In Prince George, we had no station, so we had to get our licenses out of Kelowna, BC. So when I applied for my license, my number, to this day, I still remember it, because I had it for so many years. It was XM15 1039. I used to always say, like one of my buddies with the name of Rick Young, who's also one of the neighborhood I grew up with. Him and I, we used to say it. Well, his was 956, or not 956, correction. 951, I believe. 956 belonged to the fellow that got me back into it, Nick. Used to always say XM 151039 was a quick way of saying it. Your call license. Had that until so many licenses started coming in the 70's that Kelowna decided, well, Prince George needs to have a issuing station in Prince George. So thus a station opened in Prince George and new numbers were issued. If I remember right, my new number was XM 16227, if I remember right. It's either 127 or 227. Gosh, it's been a long while since. I hardly ever used that because 1039 was used for so many years and then after I get my new one and my radio quit, I didn't bother replacing it. Thus, when I got into the skip portion of the radios, that's when the most fun take place and why you hear so many CBers having what we called skip handles. Mine was Peter Rabbit. The fellow that introduced me, got me back into it, his skip handle was Chainsaw. When Prince George first opened the station for the license, the first person that got XM 16001 and 002 for his wife, their skip handles was Twilighter and Twinkle. Twilighter was the person started a course for RRO, Restricted Radio Operators License Certificate, which is a lifetime certificate. At the time, all our licenses were basically fell under Communications Canada, and was told at that time, and that's why I signed up for the course of there. The training included proper radio usage, learning the phonetic alphabet, learning the three main distress signals, because it was worked a lot with the Provincial Emergency Program or Civil Defense. They were combined together. So I had to learn Mayday call, how to handle a Mayday, a PAM-PAM call, and a security call. In our searches also, ground to air, calculating, so that you could give that pilot and that helicopter your ground grids to minutes and degrees and seconds for the pilot of that aircraft. So thus made the license all, quote, all radios. That got changed, our typical government for you. Another reason why I don't like the government and I have no use for them. Only use for them is to get your licenses. What they did, they said anybody that had an RRO license could automatically get a call sign for that ham radio. Yeah, right. That was when it was Communications Canada. With the new name, Ministry of Science and... oh, it's such a long name, I can never remember it now. But no, it seems to me that everything these days, people and everybody has forgotten the KISS system. Keep it simple, stupid. Not anymore. That's completely thrown out the window in everything. When that radio then was given to me, I went to apply for my call sign for it. I was told, oh, your license is only land. Oh, interesting. I went on their website and I started reading. And one of the fellows from the amateur club meetings I joined, he says, oh, that's only for your ground stations, like your local radio stations. No. I had an argument with him. I said, you get a hold of the instructor, and to this day I'd like to find that original book Because when I went on the website and I started reading the ground and the marine, now that one you can just get your call number for that radio back there. Well, excuse me. In that I read same things that I learnt back in 1972 when I got my RR license. All moved around and they put it under air or marine, because you got to know those three call signs in both those departments, air and marine. But in our case, it was more, because we had to learn ground creds in order to go travel, turn it to minutes and degrees. I argued with the government over that. They wouldn't budge. Therefore, now it's forced me to take a course. Well, at my age now, 74, it's a lot harder trying to remember half the stuff to what it was back in 1972. The only stuff I remember that's easy for me is from what I learned when I was in the 60's and in 72 when I took this RRO course. That's our government for you. You cannot trust the government. And when I argued, I said, "You mean to tell me all this training that I had and this license, all it is good for is to wipe my ass with?" And I put it bluntly like that. And he said, "Yep, that's about the size of it." I said, "That's the government." I said, "Why in the hell did you have to change the name from Communications Canada in the beginning?" Well, they couldn't give me an answer on that. That sound like the government? Another example of where's your say. Anyhow, where did I leave off? 1977, when I got married. And an incident came up with the family, and we all decided move to Edmonton. So moved back to Edmonton in 1970. Excuse me. Back to Edmonton 1977. And the first job I picked there was at a place called Western Materials Handling and Equipment. Well, they were the Toyota forklift dealers. Not only did they do Toyotas, they did, when a lot of trade-ins that came in were Clark's, Heister, and that's when I first learned out that Nissan also had a forklift out. But they weren't very popular. I think it was an NC something. I don't remember exactly what there until I can find it there. Anyhow, they weren't as popular. And Toyota forklifts have become very, very popular. And the models they had was right from a little tiny small one right to a fairly big one. The International Airport in Edmonton had one of the big ones, and a little grocery store in Edmonton had one of the little ones. A lot of them were electric as well. So, in preparing some of the used ones is where I learnt my painting skills, because we'd fix one up and paint it up, or even the sale of a new one. I used to do a lot of propane conversions from the factory, and also a lift that had side lift where you could move the forks hydraulically side to side. A lot of installs of that took place. So those were some of the highlights at Western Materials. I also advanced with Western Materials to become the field mechanic, which is the mechanic that went out on the road to service and maintain forklifts. That was very interesting, because I got to see a lot of places in and around Alberta that I would have never thought of. Anyhow, during my time at Western Materials, issues came up again in the family, and the wife and I ended up having to separate, which ended up the following year in a divorce, because all I'll say at this point is because of her children. She had 3 children from her previous marriage. So I ended up getting laid off of Western Materials, and then things started going downhill as I got a little on the depressed side, so I started bouncing around until I got into a place called Erickson Datsun. So when I met a fella by the name of Bob Van, we became good friends right off the bat. And then with Bob doing a little sideline with the famous old Datsun 240Zs and 260Zs. And speaking of the Datsun Z, that was one highlight too. When I was at the Erickson Datsun, I got to do the PDI, which stands for Pre-Delivery Inspection, on the very first Datsun 280 T-Top. This T-Top so happened to also be the anniversary edition. This was all because of the famous movie called Smokey and the Bandit. That was one, still to this day, my favorite show. It did a few things though. One of the things it did do was it was the birth of overpopulating the CB radio, and then following it, the other show that came out, Convoy. Eventually, the television show called Dukes of Hazzard. All those three elements is what destroyed CB. Now you turn that CB radio on, there's hardly anybody on there anymore. You're lucky if you hear one person a month on it compared to the ham radio. Anyhow, in that time with Bob Van and doing these Datsun Z cars, what he was doing was we used to lower the car suspension, pulling the original overhead cam 6-cylinder out and putting Chrysler 318 V8s in them. One story that he told me that happened with him down in the States. And this was during the same time when Canada just switched to the metric system and the States did it. And he was driving the States and he got stopped, and the state trooper said, "This is our speed limits are here, down here are still in miles per hour." Anyway, that was a highlight at Erickson Datsun with me. From Erickson Datsun, I then went to a place called Parthenon Motors. Well, that was my next step up. Well, Parthenon Motors, this was a big one, really, for a step up. Parthenon Motors did not just handle BMW. They were the Rolls Royce. How do I describe this? As contract, or it wasn't really a dealership. So I guess that's what it's called. Contracted to do the repairs or any repairs that came up with Rolls Royce. So yes, I had experience now even on Rolls Royce. Well, I was at Parthenon Motors, and the service writer and head mechanic, he left, therefore, I became not only the head mechanic, I became the shop foreman and the service writer. So I had 3 positions. Well, I found that a little too much, so I went to the manager and said, "It's just a little bit too much because I'm not getting nothing done on my own work." So we made an agreement to hire a service writer. Therefore, it just put me down to the 2, head mechanic and foreman. That was good, all right, but he hired this fella that came straight from the UK. And it ended up, we had quite a few issues that came up with him. And I kept telling him, I said, "You're not in England anymore. You're in Canada. Things are totally different here in Canada to England." And everything I would tell a customer and something, he would come behind me and undo. So I went to the manager. I says, "Made a bad decision bringing him in." He says, "Yeah, I know, but we paid for all his expenses to come here." I said, "Well, it's like this. You're going to lose your business if you keep him." I told him bluntly because I could foresee it. I says, "Either he goes or I go." After he told me about what he had to spend to get this there, I says, "Okay, have my paycheck ready. I'll be back in half an hour." From Parthenon Motors, I went up to Stedelbauer Chev, Olds, and that was a hilarious moment that I won't forget. During our interview, the service manager there, off the record, he says, "Have you heard anything saying for what GM stands for?" GMC, that's. I says, "Well, yeah." I says, "The only thing I've heard," and I told him what my quote was. I can't say it here, but he he laughed so hard he just about fell off his chair. And also the foreman, they come up and they said, well, that's the first time I heard that one. He said, well, around here it stands for Grassman's Companion. When can you start work? So I started work the next day. That's again another place where the beginning of my health started turning around. I had this one job come in. It was in a Mercury Cougar. I had to put a new oil pump in it, and I'll be darned, it had the big block 429 in. No hoist, so I had to do this oil pump on the floor. Well, being on the floor, of course, using creepers. The way you had to drop the center link of this Cougar, as well as twisting that oil pan to get it out, twisted my back really bad that I ended up on compensation for a good week. And all I got out of compensation, again where the government screws you, I only got 3 days pay. I was off for over a week. Eventually, I had a pile of new tools I just put, but on credit. Well, I couldn't meet the payment, so I ended up losing the tools. So therefore, kind of ended my stay with Stedelbauer Chef. So I looked for something lighter to do, and that's when I started with a place called Fort Ignition. All they did was rebuilding starters, generators, and alternator, and doing tune-ups. So I was hired as the tune-up mechanic over there, as well as doing the starters, generators, and alternators. The tune-ups were sort of a sideline. The main thing was the electrical portion. That's when I met my present wife to this day, when I was at Fort Ignition. That job didn't last very long. My goodness, I don't believe this for time already. Trying to keep this short. There's a few other jobs in between that after leaving Fort Ignition and the birth of what's now known as resumes. Well, every time I tried to apply there, we'll bring a resume. Well, what the hell is a resume? Never heard of it. So it was an era, it was quite difficult to find a job or position. When I first got my ticket, the pattern was, well, if you didn't like it this place, go to the next place. Doesn't work that way anymore. Some of the places then I worked, my ex-brother-in-law, a fellow named by Wayne Rosenthal, started working with him a lot, and he had a business called Rosenthal Carpet Care. What that was basically steam cleaning carpets. So it was Wayne for quite a while. Wayne also did a lot of contracting for B-Clean janitorial service. So I had a touch of janitorial work as well as the carpet cleaner. But that was hard work on the back. Another thing through Wayne and his wife Doreen, well, this is the interesting part. Doreen was my first wife's sister. So that's why you heard me say my brother-in-law to Wayne. Anyway, Doreen knew this one had a thing called bread runs going in Edmonton, and one of her co-workers at that had a friend by the name of Ferris in an outfit called Ultimate Mover. So I ended up doing also a lot of household moving because I had experience already from prior experience on sidelines with outfits like Hart East Store here in Prince George and John's Moving. The odd time assist them in a moving job. Anyways, I was there for quite a while, but the old back issue from my first injury acted up on me again, and eventually it was becoming quite hard, and I was starting to lose my balance. And Ferris's wife, her name was Kim, she noticed that, and she says, oh, I can't be doing that anymore. So Ferris ended up, I could just drive the trucks, and he hired a crew to do the actual moving and lifting. Had one good case there. We had to one particular move where Ferris and I were known to be called the top movers in Edmonton. That gave a good feeling. Okay, those are most of my highlights and places to that point in the 80s. Getting into the 90s, well, my present wife Judy, who I met in Edmonton, as I stated, we started living together, and of course, number one comes into the picture. When number one coming into the picture, I didn't have the finances for in Edmonton. So a decision was made to move back to Prince George because it was much cheaper living here in Prince George than in Edmonton. So I came back first to Prince George, and Judy followed me the beginning of the next year, and that was 1983. Or was it 84? No, it was 83, near the end of 83, because in 1984, my first son was born. Of course, when I came back to Prince George, I'm trying to recall here, when I came back to Prince George from that move, that time, 1983, I picked up a job at Prince George Limousine. And basically what Prince George Limousine was, it was a bus outfit that handled a lot of the school buses and did a lot of charter runs. It was just a very small little outfit, and they had one MC5B coach and about 2 school buses with a couple small buses that started the airport run from downtown to the airport here. The reason I left them, and all the drivers loved what I did. They all gave me compliment. Got my paycheck, and I'll tell the story quite easily. I'm not ashamed of that one bit. Got my paycheck, and when I went to cash it, the paycheck bounced. Now I ask you, what would you do if you got a paycheck that bounced? I think your answer is going to be the same as mine. Bye-bye. But here's how I got him back. Mechanics and truck drivers have one similarity in common. Don't mess around with it. So I got him. He pressurized me to have this school bus ready that he needed it the following morning. It needed brakes. I says, I'm not putting that back on the road because it's unsafe for the road. My license is on stake. Oh, but I gotta have it, he insisted. I says, okay, this is what I'll do, Norm. I got my pen and paper, and I wrote down, I will put this butter under one condition, that I am released from all responsibility. I had him sign it. Yeah. Oh, he was mad. Madder than a wet hen. And as soon as the drivers heard what I did, they were just laughing and said, I had him just like this. I said, well, yeah. I mean, it's my license and your safety behind it. The brakes fail, and I knew they would. Who's it going to come to when the CT Canadian Transportation Safety Board gets involved in it? It'll fall on me, not the owner. Yeah, you're right. That's why you had him over under your thumb. So, would you have done the same? I'm pretty sure you would have done the same. So, I packed up my toolbox and left. But before I left, I made sure that bus was not going to get on the road. I left it sitting on the jack stands with all the tires or the wheels off. Well, things so dead here in Prince George, I couldn't get job anywhere. With rent coming up to pay and all that, and upcoming care, my dad advised me to go on welfare because my EI ran out. I'm thinking, I thought, well, I don't really want to go on welfare but I really got no choice. That, to this day, was my biggest mistake ever made. I don't know how many remember the Red Skelton show, but Red Skelton came out with a very, very good compliment in relationship to that, with a crack once made. I'm making money. I ain't never been on welfare. That's the reason why, right there. Anyhow, from the 80s to the 90s. Well, in 1984, when we come to baptize first boy, pastor sort of conned me into it so that Judy and I get married. So in 1984, we got married. With no job at stake, I started taking on side jobs, making money under the table to try to balance the financial needs. So there was several places in there. At the same time, that's basically when I started my own business of Ken's Services. What I basically did was I picked up free washers and dryers, rebuilt them, and sold them as a set. Same thing with refrigerators and ranges. So I used to fix them up, give a 30-day warranty, and sell them as a unit for $300. I was starting to make good money on that until all hell broke loose in the 90s, early 90s. Good golly, going on a lot longer than I figured it would be going on. I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to close this off. I'm not going to get into the 90s and up to present. You know what? I didn't want to do a 4-part series, but looking at this time that's gone by here, by the time I'm editing, I'm going to make a 4th part. As I said before, I'm trying to keep these videos short and under the hour, because I know if you're anything like I am, they get boring when it's just straight talking. That being said, thanks for watching. Do like, do subscribe, do share. Till the next time, adios.